Welcome to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. I'm your host, Casey Noble, and together we'll explore what it takes to excel in brand marketing at one of the most exciting and disruptive times in industry history. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. Joining us today is Dr. Michael Solomon, consumer behavior expert and professor of marketing at St. Joseph University's Hobbs School of Business. If you're listening to this podcast, you may have read one of Michael's many books in the field of marketing and consumer psychology. As a professor, author, speaker, and consultant, his research and insights are sought out by some of the biggest brands and institutions in the world. Today, we're going to be getting his take on the latest disruptions in consumer behavior. So welcome to the show, Michael. I'm excited to dive in.
Casey, thanks so much for having me on. Really appreciate it.
So let's get started. First, just for the benefit of our listeners, you have accomplished so much in the field in your career and really been a pioneer in many ways in talking about some of the topics that you're talking about and paying attention to changing consumer behavior and customer psychology and bringing that into the marketing discipline. So I'm curious, just on a personal level, what first sparked your passion for studying marketing and consumer behavior, and what's exciting to you about the field, especially today?
Yeah, well, I kind of got into it a bit sideways because my PhD is in social psychology. And when I was back in grad school, I, along with other people, were doing a lot of research on the effect of physical attractiveness on various outcomes. For example, more attractive people tend to get lighter prison sentences from jurors and things like there's a bias there. And it's very powerful. But what I realized was that for the most part, all of the research was looking from here to here. And yet so much of the information about who we are, our social identity, who we are, who we're trying to be, who we're not trying not to be, et cetera, is also included in the, from here, from the chin down. And I started to develop this interest in the psychology of fashion and the impact of clothing on behavior. And so I did my dissertation on that and started to really become intrigued by that. And so over time, especially when I got a job in a business school rather than a psychology department, my focus shifted to lifestyles in general and really a lot of the overlooked, but really, really important drivers of purchases that have very little to do with the functionality of the product itself, but a lot to do with what we want those products to be and how we incorporate them in our daily lives. So over the years, I've kind of broadened my focus. I've done a lot of work with the apparel industry, but I've also worked with other industries like automotive and home interiors, et cetera, because all of these different products are things that are so crucial to our self-identity. And that's the cornerstone on which much of marketing and certainly consumer psychology is built. So once I opened that door and walked through it, I've been having a great time ever since.
It's awesome. Let's dive into what some of those trends and drivers are today. You've spent your career pinpointing and tracking some of the major disruptions and shifts in why consumers buy, like you're talking about that connection between personal identity and product or brand and how we make choices, right? What are some of the biggest shifts that you're seeing recently in consumer behavior that are significantly impacting the marketing landscape, and what's sort of driving those shifts?
Well, we're in a period of great change, have been for a number of years. Of course, we had this little thing you may remember called COVID. We're trying to forget it. But what I like to say is that actually didn't cause any significant changes in behavior other than maybe elbow bumps or something instead of a handshake. But what it did was to kind of light the fire under changes that were already happening. So we had some big disruptions. I'll mention one or two, but when COVID hit, basically our daily lives were kind of disrupted. We call that unfreezing, where we suddenly are willing to consider new ways of doing things because the old ways aren't working. And as I'm sure you know, that one of the hardest things in marketing is just to get consumers to try something new because we do tend to be set in our ways very often. So COVID hit and moved these things down the line. And for example, some of the obvious ones like online shopping, especially for groceries. That is something that was happening, but now as the floodgates have opened on that, we probably won't be going back to where we were before. Another obvious one is working from home versus working from the office. These are some of the major changes that we can talk about as we get into this conversation. But basically, the relationship between consumers and the products and services and stores that they choose has fundamentally changed. So that, to me, the biggest change, and this was well before COVID, is that to a much greater extent, we as consumers are in the driver's seat today. Marketers are not powerless by any means, but the successful marketers, for the most part, I believe, are the ones that have figured out that it no longer makes much sense to keep your customers at arm's length, but rather to the extent to which you can actively engage them in the entire marketing process, whether it's ideas for new products, ideas for new promotions, involving them directly in some kind of a, ambassador program or something like that. These are the new ways of doing marketing. A lot of it is content marketing. I know your listeners are very interested. So much of it is outbound versus inbound and all of that. And we talk more about it. But back in the old days, it was very much, I like to think of it as kind of a one-way street where the marketers were totally in charge, and they drove the bus and we had a ride in it. But today it's much more of a shared experience and constantly evolving.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned something really important, which is sort of that desire for, a self-directed experience. And I think, as you mentioned, that acceleration of digital and now sort of a digital interface in many ways being the way that we're engaging with brands and making purchases and things like that puts a lot of emphasis on the experience that's being provided, especially in a digital context. And then maybe the continuity of that experience when you're talking about in store, if you're a retail brand to digital, and then we get into omni-channel and all of that. But what do you see? And you've mentioned a few of these things like that involvement in product development and things like that. What do you see consumers craving or wanting from brand experiences today that's changed? Any specific things that we can be thinking about and providing? And are there brands that you see doing this particularly well? Any examples that you can point to?
Yeah. So I think what consumers want today, you use a great word, experience. What we're looking for is an experience. And that's especially true in the purchase domain, because one thing that online world has done is it's raised the bar, obviously, for offline or, bricks and mortar retailers. Because what we have to do today, the reality is 98% of anything we could want to buy, we could do it with a click rather than visiting a store. And so is bricks and mortar retailing dead? I don't think so. But anyone who thinks that they're just operating a place where customers come to pick up merchandise and pay for it does not understand the landscape today, because we don't need stores anymore to do that. And when I say stores, I'm also talking about any kind of retail, restaurants, hospitality. There has to be some value added, as opposed to sitting in your pajamas and clicking and the nice UPS man comes the next day. Marketers need to give us a reason to, get off our butts, put on clothing, get in our cars, drive to the mall, fight the traffic, all of those things. They need to give us a reason to do that over and above the physical product itself. Most stores, I don't think, have figured that out. Sure, they like to make the store a nice environment and it smells nice or something, but they're not really telling a story the same way that brands need to tell that story. And so who's doing it right? Say some outdoor retailer like REI that in some of their stores allows customers to actually use the products. You might test out a raincoat in a rain chamber that they have. You can stand in there. And then I think on weekends, sometimes they even organize camping trips where their store associates take groups of customers out to use their camping equipment, for real. That type of experience, some of the things they do for kids, like the Build-A-Bear workshop or those places where you get drunk and paint ceramics or whatever, those are, experience-oriented things. And of course, with brands themselves, you're also selling an experience. You're selling a story. You're asking people to kind of live the experience in their minds, but it's a great story nonetheless. And so to me, great marketing comes down to great storytelling. And I have a feeling you'll agree with that. And the question is, how do you tell that story and who do you get to tell that story? And again, the really successful ones are the ones that enlist their customers to help tell that story. And anything that involves your customers as more than just pawns in the process. What I like to say is, it's just a matter of switching out a very, very small word for another one. And that is, we need to move from marketing to our customers to marketing with our customers. If you look at a brand like, say, Legos, they've had an amazing renaissance. They were almost bankrupt, I think, at one point. One of the reasons for their success is they have this vast network of users around the world that are so involved because they get to actually submit ideas to Lego for a new model or something like that. And so we all know it's just human nature. If someone asks you for your opinion, you're flattered. If they listen to your opinion, you're even more flattered, and they're going to be your friend forever. So why wouldn't companies do that as well?
Yeah. And what do you think makes for a strong brand story? How do you approach that when you're consulting brands or even institutions or other types of organizations on how to sort of like telegraph what they do? What are the bones of that?
One of the easiest things that you can do to, I guess you might say, to test the strength of a brand story or a brand image is a simple projective test that you do a lot in focus groups when you're doing research on product development, et cetera. And that is very simply to say, well, suppose that your brand, insert your brand here, comes to life one morning as a person, and you find this person sitting on the edge of your bed. Was your perfume or something that you kept on your nightstand, but it's turned into a person. I want you to think about who that person is. Are they male, female, young, old, black, white, etc.? Tell me a story about that person. What kind of music do they like? What are their hobbies, etc.? In other words, create a really vivid brand persona, they're calling it these days. And if you can't do that, if you think that's a preposterous request, then your brand probably has a problem. Furthermore, if you get a different story when you ask five people, maybe customers or employees or what have you, if you get a different picture from each of those people, you also know that you have a problem. So that brand experience I think it has to be shared, as I've been saying. There are different kinds of stories, of course. One of the most popular ones is the founder story. How did the company get founded? Hewlett Packard, Apple. A lot of times with entrepreneurs, I think it's useful. People are today what I call brand genealogists. They want to know where their stuff came from. I was once in a restaurant and there was a seafood item listed. It had the name of the guy who caught the fish on the menu, which is a little extreme, but I think that's what people are looking for today. So you want to give people enough of the raw material to construct the story. Maybe it's two sisters who had trouble finding a gentle enough soap for their babies, so they started a new soap company. People love those kinds of stories. Everybody has their own story. Of course, if you don't have a story, sometimes you make one up. That's why we have spokes characters like the Keebler Elves or the Jolly Green Giant. They're all telling stories. So that's fine. But what I tell brand managers is if your brand has a story, tell it. Don't hide that under a bushel, because that authenticity, especially younger consumers today, that's the holy grail. They want to know it's not just a bunch of suits, sitting in an office. They want to know what that organization stands for, how they're giving back, all of those things, how are they being sustainable, but also who are they? What are their values? What do they stand for? That is something that we have never seen before in marketing. And in fact, it's amazing because the common wisdom always was never discuss religion, sex, politics. When you're talking about, well, the sex part, maybe you use that to sell the product, but certainly religion or politics, that never enters into it. And of course, today, the first question people want to know is, what's your brand's position on Black Lives Matter or abortion or what have you? I'm not sure how long that's going to last because, frankly, I think most brands don't have a lot to say about these things. But certainly there's a lot of room for change. And that is what, especially younger people, I know my students, that's what they're looking for all the time.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you're tapping into that, sort of social justice marketing, which has become very big focus for brand marketers today. What's our position, brand identity, and bringing that to the forefront. We've seen, I think especially since COVID, you speak a lot about hitting this next level of brand loyalty, right? Creating customer fans. And you were just talking a little bit about that. You've said before that people don't buy products for what they do, they buy them because of what they mean. And so I think you were just pointing to a little bit of that sort of mindset. Do you think that more brand switching has sort of happened today in part because brands are failing at this? Because we're not making our products mean more to our customers, and therefore you're sort of putting yourself into a commoditized category, like you become a commodity because that's how you're being classified. Is that sort of one of the keys here?
That is one of the keys. I think I'll pick a number, 80%, I'm making that up, but a large percentage of brands are not following through on this. They're not distinguishing between attributes and benefits. That's marketing 101, right? Attributes, what the product does, benefits, what is the value of what it does to me. So people don't care about functionality. They want to know that it works, but the reality is that today, stuff mostly works. But if you look at almost any category, and certainly in any consumer category, you look at the market leader, the number one, maybe number two, you'll see that they're usually way, way above the next cohort, numbers 3 through 5 or 7. And often the reason is that it's not that their product is any better necessarily. It's that they're telling a story that people want. And, if you look at the usual suspects like Nike, for example, Lululemon, et cetera, they've done a great job of showing people that they're going to give you the goods. It's going to perform, but you're also going to be having this experience, or you're going to at least be aware of their experience during this. And so again, there's that value added, giving people that extra reason to buy something. And back in the old days, we call that the unique selling proposition, right? But that USP is not just an attribute like miles per gallon. That USP we should call it a unique value proposition, not a unique selling proposition, if that makes sense. That's what people are looking for. Don't show me what it does. Show me how that's going to make my life more interesting or easier, or whatever the benefit happens to be. And which is not to say that nobody gets this. Like I'm saying, some of the big brands, they definitely get this, and I'm not going to tell them how to do their marketing. They know how to do it. It's everybody else that, that has a bit of a challenge because they haven't figured this out yet, and they're fighting the benefits war with new attributes. And that's not what people are looking for. They want that experience.
So it sounds like even, yeah, not attributes, but almost having that identity. And what does that mean to your customer in terms of an aspirational value or an emotional value? So maybe putting more emphasis on the emotional value versus the product benefits.
Yeah. And, it's certainly aspirational, is a good way to think about it. A lot of marketing is obviously aspirational. Sometimes it's too aspirational in that marketers show us images of things or people that we can never attain because, for example, beautiful models that don't exist in the real world because they've been photoshopped to death. These people don't exist. How can we live up to this? So that's kind of the dark side of aspirational marketing. But yeah, I mean, people are not content just to be where they are. We're always moving, working toward our life as a project. I want to be better at this, whether it's being a better executive or tennis player or just being more sophisticated or whatever your goals are. There are products and services out there that will help you to attain those goals. And that is why we buy products. We don't buy them because we think they're cute. We buy them because they're going to help us in some way. But again, that help is not just about making us run faster necessarily. That help is helping us to clarify our own feelings about ourselves and our goals and aspirations.
So I think something that I found really interesting in your work is some of the recent conversations you've sparked around this idea of the chameleon consumer in terms of understanding who that particular audience is, how they identify themselves in order to then be able to think about connecting with them. So in your book, The New Chameleons, you put forward that today's consumers sort of actively defy traditional types of categorization. So can you just explain for listeners, briefly what you mean by the chameleon consumer and that concept and how that's impacting marketing today?
I use the metaphor of the chameleon because, of course, chameleons change their skin. They basically blend in with their surroundings. So they're actually changing, if you will, their visual identity multiple times a day, right? We as consumers are doing the same thing. We are changing our identities sometimes multiple times a day. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Marketers tend to have this notion that they have this broad market. They love to put consumers into categories like demographic categories, for example, male, female, income, all those things, age, place of residence, et cetera, and then assume that everybody they put into a category is the same for their purposes and they have the same aspirations and so on. That's often a big mistake. Of course, even if you introduce some psychographic variables, like interest in new things, innovativeness and things like that, you're still not really getting into the fragmentation of our society today. These systems were developed back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the last century because at that time we lived in a broadcast society, right? We had 3 or 4 TV channels. We had large market segments. And so if you wanted to reach a good piece of the country, you were pretty sure if you bought a commercial time on, say, the Ed Sullivan Show in the early 60s, you'd get a big chunk of the country watching that. Other than maybe the Super Bowl today, you're not going to get that. You have this enormous fragmentation. Now, that's relevant to your question about whether brands are doing a good job, because in a sense, even though brand loyalty is way, way down, it's not the brand's fault. One of the things that is causing that, I think, is that there are so many more brands out there, a lot of newer, smaller brands. And so even though people are still using the old ones, they're always switching out or trying new ones. They're being much more proactive about it. So yes, in general, this issue of brand loyalty, of course, that's the holy grail for us in marketing. But we have to remember that people are not just adopting a brand and then using it their whole lives. They might have different portfolios of brands. To give you an easy example, a lot of women might have a fragrance that they spray on if they're still working in an office. They go to the office, that's their day fragrance. They're going out at night, they have a different fragrance. So usually what we see is in different situations in our lives as we play different roles, parent, lover, teacher, buyer, employee, we need different sets of products to accomplish those things. And that's the way you package a lifestyle proposition, I think, is you show people how the brand is related to a lifestyle that they are aspiring to.
Does that go as far as you feeling like we as brand marketers and as brands need to change our expectations in terms of market share almost, with expecting that we're going to move away from this environment in which a few core brands, and you'll always have, your Coca-Colas and your Nikes, but own the market, and like we're sharing with more other brands, and we kind of have to focus on finding our people, the qualified audience, versus trying to capture everybody in that entire market. Does it go that far?
That's a good point. And I think, maybe with a few exceptions, like something like automotive, where you're just never going to have, 100 brands in there. You used an example of Coca-Cola. You say Coca-Cola owns the market, but look what Coca-Cola is doing to keep that market. They understand that people aren't drinking Coca-Cola near as much as they used to, especially younger people. So they're developing new products, they're acquiring brands, they're getting into the energy drinks, the vitamin waters. That's where their growth is coming from. So even though you're a behemoth like Coca-Cola, you recognize that nothing lasts forever. And you have to keep innovating and changing. And, the marketing graveyard is full of companies that thought they had it figured out. And so they stopped innovating. One of my favorite examples is the Sony Walkman. You're too young to even remember what that is, probably. But that was the first product that allowed you to take your music mobile, right? With headphones and everything like that. And when they came out, there was something called a cassette. You've seen them in museums. And, you put that cassette in, right? And then later, there were other modifications with CDs, et cetera. But Sony never saw the whole streaming thing coming. They figured, okay, we've cornered the mobile market. And so today, if I ask, a class of my students, how many of you own a Sony music player? They look at me like I'm from Mars. And there was a time when everybody owned a Sony. I owned a Sony, but they dropped the ball. And so even if you're complacent enough to think that you're where you want to be, you may not be there in 5 years. So, and that's underscores the importance of going back to your customers and especially To me, the biggest error that marketers make, you didn't ask me, but I'll tell you anyway, the biggest error that marketers make is that they neglect their current customers in favor of acquiring new customers. So that new shiny object is always more attractive than cultivating your current customers, upselling them, getting more value and loyalty out of them. And so we have that famous 80-20 rule that marketers, many of them know about, right? 80% of your sales come from 20% of your customers. That 20% is probably your loyal group. So they're relatively small in numbers, but they are the lifeblood of your organization. And so many times I see that marketers say, okay, check the box. I got him as a customer. Don't need to come back to him anymore. Now I need to convince Casey that she needs to come into the fold because my bonus is based on market share, today, as opposed to customer lifetime value, which is a much bigger number.
And you mentioned something earlier with regards to the sort of chameleon consumer and the fragmentation of the landscape. And we encounter this a lot from a content marketing standpoint with literally the fragmentation of various platforms, especially when you're talking about digital, but even like the offline and online experience that we were talking about earlier. Are there ways that we need to change the way that we market in order to reach the chameleon consumer, given that they seem to be, as much as they're, sort of changing colors in terms of identity, they're trying on new platforms. They're using this platform for that. They're researching in different ways. What are your thoughts on sort of channel marketing, given that fragmentation?
Yeah. Well, probably the best channel is P2P, right? It's horizontal marketing where users are proselytizing other users. They're obviously more credible. And of course, that's why we have this whole influencer phenomenon and so on, right? So that's a very valuable channel. Just getting consumers to talk about how they are using the product is something that a lot of companies drop the ball on. And that's where you can get a lot of clues about modifying a product, et cetera. For example, in the B2B space, they're actually way ahead of the B2C people in terms of listening to their customers, which I find very interesting. So by some estimates, the large majority of new product ideas in industries like chemicals and aviation, the ideas come from the clients. The majority of new product ideas come from the customers who buy the stuff because they're the ones who actually use it. And, they're in the trenches and understand when it doesn't work or what it could do better, et cetera. I think a lot of content marketers are ignoring the potential of the people they're trying to reach in terms of engaging them in more of a two-way conversation instead of just kind of preaching to them and pushing content down through the funnel, et cetera. And also, there's some ethical things that scare me about the technology with, of course, AI and all that, but even our ability just to track people, database marketing and so on. We know so much about people now that some people are talking about markets of one. We can think about each consumer as their own market in the sense that it is possible and to some extent already being done by some companies that every contact we have with a company is personalized to us directly. It's based on our prior responses. It's based on predictions that AI can provide about what we're interested in, et cetera. But the idea is that it may be subtle, but the message you get and the message I get from company A will not be the same.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's really fascinating because there's so much emphasis on leveraging tech and AI to have this down to the individual view of the customer. And you were just talking about the importance of focusing on your existing customers and mining what you know about them and engaging them in the process of new product development, how they want to be marketed to, what challenges they're facing so that you can adjust content. Do you feel like there's sort of a risk of too much emphasis on getting that information through technology and expecting to be able to mine the data that we're going to lose sight or we're losing sight of ways to more meaningfully sort of like one-on-one on the individual level, whether it's through customer panels and things like that, gathering that information? Like, do you think there's a lot lost there?
Well, the problem is that what marketers tend to do, as human beings tend to do, is when we find something that we like that works, we keep using it. We become a hammer in search of a nail. So I figured out this database stuff. That's what I'm going to do. It's foolish to put all your eggs in one basket, no matter what you're doing. And so I would certainly advocate not abandoning the types of things you're talking about. And when we talk today about journey mapping, really following the customer very minutely as they actually experience the product or service, whatever, or website, whatever it is, that's where you can really start to identify some friction points, some pain points, and so on. You could do similar things with user experience and so on. When you do websites, you also need to do that. But my point is, I don't think it's a good thing for companies to only have customers who are digital entries in a spreadsheet somewhere. That's probably not a great idea.
So we have to have that balance, right? I'm curious, just thinking ahead, and you had mentioned, AI, and obviously in the last couple of years, we've seen this massive acceleration and the adoption of generative AI in marketing in particular is sort of one of those first major areas of the business where it's gaining sort of traction. What are your thoughts? What have you discovered so far about consumer reactions to AI being used in marketing and, maybe specifically even generative AI when it comes to engaging with content that is created by AI versus people? What are sort of the watch outs that you're seeing there?
Well, if anyone tells you that they know the future of AI and all that, I've got a bridge to sell you because I don't think anybody really knows that. But to me, from my perspective, one of the biggest issues that we have to confront, which we have not done satisfactorily, is the issue of consumer trust in these sources. In general, we're suffering from a huge crisis of confidence, as you know. I mean, nobody believes the news, nobody believes what they see in ads. And of course, now we have deep fakes and all of that, which is going to make life really, really difficult, I think, for a lot of marketers. Going to be a lot of counterfeit messaging out there. And so it's really crucial to rebuild that trust. And when people don't know who they're talking to, in some studies I've seen, people aren't necessarily sure when they call a help center if they're talking to a live person or a chat bot or what have you. And I think some of my own work that I'm doing now has to do with how we can get consumers to trust these sources more. And especially it's going to be interesting for subjective decisions. I'm looking right now in the fashion area. Will women take fashion advice from an AI fashion stylist? And some of it has to do very simply with the appearance of that source. If you dress somebody, if you put a robot on a screen, they're probably not going to be very effective. If they're made up to look like you and they tell me to buy something, maybe I'll buy it. So we're just scratching the surface there. And we need to get a handle on that before this thing leaves us behind. The problem is that marketers have a tendency to poison the well. They stumble on a great idea, then everybody wants to do that idea. They do it to death, and then they move on to the next one now that they've destroyed that. So I hope that won't happen with AI, but with other things like influencers and so on, now we're seeing a crisis of confidence where people are starting to doubt the influencers. So I think before we go running off outsourcing our marketing department to an AI, we've got to figure out who we are and how we're going to connect with our customers so that they know it's really us and that we mean what we say.
Yeah. Just on that note, what are some of your big key takeaways right now? I know you're still researching this currently, but in terms of the new way and the new measures that we'll need to take to establish or reestablish trust with our customers.
Yeah. I think the biggest takeaway for me is I like to say fish where the fish are. Don't sit in your office and speculate about what your customers might like. Get off your butt, get out there. They used to call it managing by walking around on the factory floor. Get out there and see what your customers are actually doing with your product, because it's very possible, for example, that they have modified it in some way to make it even better or to make it different or to appeal to a different segment, etc. But you'll never know that if you just do, 7 points attitude surveys that are done over the computer, etc. That's not going to work. So I think that's a really big takeaway. And the other is, remember that your brand is a person. Your brand needs to be nurtured, and we need to know who that person is and make sure that that person's someone that your customers are going to want to invite into their homes.
I love that. I think those are great takeaways for the audience today. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Solomon. I know we're kind of at time here. If I can, I would love to keep you on for a couple more minutes and ask you some speed round questions we usually close with, if you're game.
All right. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so this is easy. It's just a few short questions. First, as a marketing and consumer behavior thought leader, as you're thinking about the industry and all the things we just discussed, what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night is this erosion of consumer trust in our discipline and the fact that there's always a few bad apples that spoil it for everyone else. So we need to be much more proactive about regaining that trust.
And what keeps you going?
Probably as my students. Every year I come into the classroom and I'm a year older, but they're not. They're still 20 years old. So I learn a lot from them every year.
And what marketing term do you love?
The chameleon consumer. How's
The
that? I
chameleon.
made that.
Yes, absolutely. What marketing term do you hate right now?
A very dangerous term right now is green marketing
Ah,
because,
good one.
again, unfortunately, we have this problem with greenwashing. You've probably heard that term, where these bad apples I was referring to, something like 90% of all environmental claims are false or exaggerated. And so to say that we're doing green marketing, that's looking for the green, which is the dollar. It may help you in the short term, but in the long term, when people no longer believe any claim that any marketer makes, then we really have a problem.
Hmm. Absolutely. And what emoji do you think best describes the current state of marketing?
Worried.
I got yesterday, I was speaking with Tamsin Webster, right? Who's,
Oh, I know things.
yeah, she's awesome, right? And she did face palm. So I feel like it's similar. Yours might be like the sweat emoji,
Yeah,
right? But
right.
yeah, a
Mhm.
time to take things seriously. There's a lot in flux that we need to sort of take control of, I think. And what's your take on this sort of age old debate of quality versus quantity?
Well, I was talking before about the 80-20 rule, and many marketers come down on the side of quantity when quality is clearly the answer.
Love it. Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Solomon, again for coming on.
My pleasure. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to Content Disrupted, brought to you by Skyward. Stay up to date on the latest ideas and insights in brand building and content marketing by visiting our website at skyward.com. Join us for our next episode, where we'll continue to challenge marketing norms and inspire you with fresh strategies for growing business through brand storytelling. See you there.